Modest fashion is a phrase that has become synonymous with this billion-dollar industry, while at the same time, representation of clothing sensitive to religious requirements that continue to this day to remain a lightning rod of division in some societies. And tonight we'll aim to deconstruct and examine that concept and how it's applied through the lens of consumption, religion, and changing social structures and societies. I will briefly introduce our speakers, and the first of whom will begin in a few minutes. And with us tonight, we have Zumrat Sönmez, the activist and journalist. Zumrat's own experience and interaction with changing laws and cultures surrounding religious dress in Turkey are marked through her activism and positioning as a visibly Muslim woman throughout that period of change. And she's joining us from Washington, D.C. tonight, where she is currently the executive producer at the TRT World. Also with us, Ursula de Castro, the pioneering leader from the sustainable fashion movement. She'll be speaking about sustainability and its interaction with modest fashion, looking at how the themes work together and include social stigmas and the impacts of the interactions of various groupings with sustainability and how sometimes some of those groupings are left out. Myself, in my journalistic career, I have over the last decade investigated, reported, and explored the changes within the modest movement while living through it. As a young British Muslim woman, through my academic research, I was able to take that experience and interest and delve deeper into the discourses in that area. And I really look forward to sharing some of that research. So without wasting too much time on our introductions, let's go to Zumrat.
Well, thank you. Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank my friend Yasmin and the William Temple Foundation for inviting me to speak at this event today. And thank you for joining us. My name is Zumrat Sönmez. I'm a journalist based in Washington, D.C. Previously, I lived in London for 2 years, working as a journalist and studying my master's degree at SOAS. I'm also a hijab ban survivor. Back in the 90s in Turkey, we had a headscarf ban in schools and mine. Today, I will talk about the impact on my life. But let me start from the beginning so you have the full picture. I was born in Istanbul in 1984 to a conservative working class family. Traditionally, in my family, girls didn't pursue higher education. My generation changed that. I grew up to become the first woman to earn a university degree and the only woman with a professional career overseas in my family. But my education was something that I had to fight for. At age 11, I was sent to a religious high school and started wearing a headscarf as a compromise with my family so I could continue my education. But I had a bigger fight coming up. In February 28, 1997, my country was hit by a so-called postmodern coup d'etat when the Turkish military issued a memorandum targeting what it deemed rising Islamist ideology. The biggest outcome of this coup was the headscarf ban, the infamous headscarf ban, which banned hijabi women from entering public institutions, schools, and universities. It forced thousands of young women, including myself, to either give up their education or I had to make the biggest decision of my life. I chose my identity and decided not to remove my headscarf. For me, it was an unlikely decision. I always had big dreams and I had never thought of choosing anything over my education. But my decision was not entirely a religious one. I started wearing the headscarf, started wearing modestly and covering my hair because of my religious beliefs. But I also believed that God would forgive me if I took it off for my education. So my decision was rather a political one. It was by the state that was trying to regulate and dictate my personal choices. Even at that age, even as a teenager. So I know it felt the same for so many others. So after some of us got together and we studied philosophic studies and languages. We had book clubs where we read serious books with big titles and discussed them together. So this way we were educating ourselves and each other. But outside of our own circle, we were underdogs. We were rebels, radicals, anarchists, even in the eyes of our own families and neighbors, simply because we didn't do what the government told us to do. In the 90s, there was also a huge anti-Muslim campaign in the Turkish media. TV channels and newspapers were full of stories about radicals who abused women. The goal was to portray the state as the savior of these women and justify the military coup while demonizing religious Muslim communities in the country. That created a massive stigma around Muslim women and men who were visibly religious. It promoted this image of Muslim women as victims of sexual oppression who needed to be rescued. But Muslim women were also being punished by not being allowed to work or study. Even though the Headscarf Ban only included public and state institutions, private sector didn't want to hire Muslim women either in that environment. And those who were able to find a job were underpaid, and in many cases, they were not treated equally. After a 9-year gap, I was finally able to go to university in 2010. The Headscarf Ban was eased following a major shift in the country's political landscape. By then, I had also started my professional career without a university degree as a book editor and journalist. It's been 12 years since then, but I still remember the first time I set foot in the campus of Istanbul University. It is one of the oldest and most prestigious universities in Turkey, where the Headscarf Ban was strictly implemented. I remember walking in the corridors feeling thrilled, but also afraid, as if someone could just throw me out, as if I did not belong. Because of that fear, I studied and worked at the same time tirelessly and didn't allow myself to fail so I could finish my degree before it happened again. The Headscarf Ban and not being allowed inside these institutions was the only reality that I grew up in. It felt like this was my only chance and could be taken away any moment. Today, I am an international journalist who has 2 master's degrees, both with distinction, from leading universities in the UK and Turkey. I work for TRT World, which is run by Turkish Radio and Television Corporation, a public institution where for many years I was not allowed to work. I felt the same thrill and the same fear on my first day there as well. And even today, I still struggle to believe how far we've come as a country in terms of providing equal opportunities for hijabi women. Over the years, the normalization of headscarf reflected in many areas of life, including fashion industry in Turkey. Ironically today, Turkey is a global center of modest fashion. But back in the 90s, when I first started wearing the headscarf, there was only one brand that made clothes for hijabi women. I remember the first suit my father bought for me. It was a 2-piece Afghan style suit, which had traditional prints. It was green. So imagine an 11-year-old girl with a headscarf in those clothes, walking in the streets of Istanbul in the 90s. There was already a stigma and I was not helping. But there was no alternative. Only thing that was available to me was simply highlighting my strangeness. It was as if even capitalism rejected our money. With normalization came the market interest. First, we had our own folks, women like me, making clothes for us. Then big brands noticed the potential, and now we have Nike and Adidas making workout clothes for hijabi women. Personally, I'm very happy to have options and happy to finally be able to express my identity comfortably, especially because the fight still goes on. As a visibly Muslim woman who lived in the US and the UK and traveled a lot around the world, I experienced firsthand that we need more representation. In France, Canada, and India, we still see Muslim women being stigmatized and discriminated because of the way they look. In Turkey, the headscarf ban is no longer in place, but the stigma is still there. It's only taking different colors. Headscarf is still one of the most politicized issues in Turkey, and our experience is still alive in our memories. My whole life was defined by it, and I still need to explain that 9-year gap in my resume. It is a heavy burden, to be honest, and whether to carry it is a decision that we have to make, or we make consciously or subconsciously every day. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you very much for your time. You have been a lovely audience. That's all from me for now.
Thank you so much, Zumrat. That was incredibly inspiring to listen to, I'm sure for everyone else in the audience as well. I'll hand over now to Ursula de Castro, who's joining us, who's also just back in London now.
Yes. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really, really delighted to be here today. I was so inspired by what you said, and actually the identification that I feel from a completely different perspective, but with that concept of stigma. So in my case, I had and always have had a passion for clothing. I love all types of clothes, broken, elegant, my own, other people's. But my point was that I loved the bodies inside those clothes as well. And although it was kind of logical that I would work in fashion, I found that my own principles and my own values were the opposite to the industry that I was somehow getting into. Obviously, I always bought vintage, secondhand. That in itself has been stigmatized hugely. But the whole concept of wanting to work ethically in an industry that isn't was problematic from the very start. And I knew that I could only work in this industry if I remained true to my heart, true to my own personal values. I mean, I'm talking 25 years ago, and I'm telling you, the fashion industry was abusive, exploitative, still is. But there was no sense of respect towards people and protection over nature. And as I'm saying, I'm passionate about people and the environment, the earth that we all share. So for me, it was imperative that I would show my rebelliousness, that I would rebel against this industry that was stigmatizing me and the way that I felt and the type of woman that I wanted to be. And weirdly enough, my rebelliousness was to show keeping in an industry that is hell-bent on throwing, and being kind in an industry that very definitely isn't, because when we see human rights abuses and the exploitation and extraction of natural resources, we can see that kindness is not the word that this industry chooses to describe itself. And so that to me was imperative, that I should be able to work in an industry of respect. So, you know, as far as keeping, the only antidote to a throwaway society is to keep, but it also measured my kindness when it comes to the people who makes our clothes, because I find it profoundly disrespectful that we should be throwing away the toil of other people whom we know are potentially working in hardships and in difficult working conditions. However, today, if you don't mind, I'm going to read a little bit from my book, which is called Loved Clothes Last. And it's a book I wrote already well into my fashion revolution journey. In fact, while we're here, there is a brilliant fashion revolution team in Turkey. If you happen to also be in Turkey, I suggest you follow, but we have teams all over the world. This little bit of the book is called Why Transparency, and it includes something which I call the love check, which has been, I was really glad to see it go viral. The present fashion industry is built on secrecy. Its supply chain disconnected at every stage of the manufacturing process. with brands and their producers often operating alone and fragmented, caught up in arrangements where invisibility defines the rules, leading to gross inefficiency, opaqueness, and a system where human rights violations and environmental abuses are hidden and justified. In fact, the way the supply chain works is a perfect mirror of the culture that this industry thrives on: closed doors, elitism, imbalances of power, and exclusion of practically everyone, bear the anointed few. These attributes are manifest throughout, from the way fashion portrays itself in advertising and social media, to the way it treats its workers, from garment makers to student interns. The fashion industry seconds exploitation and abusive behavior. It has them embedded as part of its image, and power reigns supreme even in the smallest hierarchies. As wish to be treated is one of the most disruptive agents when it comes to moving forward, because it challenges just about everything this industry stands for. Transparency brings visibility and accountability. And right now, we need a fashion industry that better understands its own inner workings and respects the people who work in its value chain. What we need is a clear, uninterrupted line of vision from the product's origins to its disposal, to foster dignity, empowerment, and justice for the people who make our clothes and to protect the environment we all share. Although we can't undo the way our existing clothes were made, we should nevertheless be aware of their social impact and consider how little or how much we really know. Take your eyes off this book for a few seconds and think, what am I wearing? Rather like the mindful meditation that instead of focusing on your inner self, take a look at your second skin, the clothes you're wearing, and ask yourself just a few questions. What am I wearing right now? Do I know who made it? Did I check the label for information before I bought it? Have I, in fact, ever checked the labels inside? Do I remember where I bought it? Do I know where it was made? Do I love it enough to mend it or have it repaired if it breaks? Do I have any plans for its end of life? The exploitation that is so prevalent in the fashion supply chain today is made even more humiliating under the lens of disposability. If a piece has been made under conditions of forced labor or illegal low pay, that is a tragedy in itself. But the fact that the garment made will also enter a cycle of disrespect, bought to be thrown away after 2 wears, begs the question, why? Why exploit people in the pursuit of rubbish? One of my quotes that has gone viral said, "It isn't enough just looking for quality in the products we buy. We must insist that there is quality in the lives of the people who made them." I look forward to questions later and to a conversation. I hope this was relevant today.
Thank you so much, Ursula, for the incredible work that you do. We've known each other for more than a decade now, and I remember being very much inspired when I first met you in one of your warehouses with so many sort of the leftover bits of fabric that aren't used. No, it's incredibly inspiring and an amazing book. Now, I will be speaking a little bit about my research into the area which I have been doing as a William Temple Foundation scholar over the last few years, and an evolution of my own work in the area as a journalist and as a scholar for William Temple Foundation, and now as a research fellow. So it's a great privilege to be here and be speaking about this research alongside Ursula and Zumrat, who are both incredibly inspiring to me. Now, the appearance of modest fashion in societies today is incredibly wide-ranging. with different elements elevated depending on the cultural or generational group you happen to be in. So we see it play out in different ways around the world, but not necessarily because of national borders, but often because through generational groups or the culture that you adhere to. And what we mean by cultures is often a culture that's emerged through the social media, because the trends that we see aren't ones that are halted by national borders. And that's been increasingly throughout the last decade. And what we see as the most elevated aspect of modest fashion most commonly is the hijab. The hijab is the most obvious signifier, and it remains the element when you think of modest dress, particularly in the context of Muslim women, you think of the hijab. And of course, we've seen modest fashion through the lens of Jewish women, particularly in the US, and modest fashion through the lens of Christian women as well. And we see modest fashion being taken on as a major trend within the fashion industry, one that reduces and takes away the religious elements, but still applies the dress in a very similar way. But what differentiates it within the Muslim community is often the hijab, a signifier that has become the element so elevated, where other parts of modest dress often have been reduced in the way we see it applied in modern times. Now, we see the hijab appear in various ways on fashion shows. I mean, most recently, we saw Linda Evangelista on the cover of British Vogue. We've seen it on the catwalk. Over the last decade, we've seen the framing of hijab as a piece of cloth. And I remember watching a video about 8 years ago, and the hijab was being described, normalized. There was this real effort to make the hijab appear and feel very normal. And this demystification argument was to say, well, it's just a piece of cloth. It doesn't mean anything beyond that. So stop thinking of it as something scary. But through doing so, it was reducing it to something which appeared fundamentally and solely as the material that it held. And we know through religious practice, it's very much not that. So when you look at existing literature around the hijab, and modest fashion and the way it's been framed, it's either framed in one of two ways. It's either framed through the context of, oh, it's just a piece of cloth, so it means nothing. You shouldn't think of it as something different because it's, anyone could wear it, or, there's no context or purpose or deeper meaning. It is its material. So why the intense scrutiny? Or those who often are behind the scrutiny, using it to completely politicize the hijab. So we see that in the laws that have been applied. I mean, Zumrit presented an incredibly interesting personal case study of the way in which laws were applied to politicizing the hijab and what it represented. And we see that in the context of laws in France and in various other places where the hijab is testament to a heightened political identity. And for the last 20 years, Muslim identities have been the center and front of many conversations, mostly under the banner of counter-extremism, with the headscarf and other visible signifiers, with other Muslim visible signifiers becoming symbolic, religious and political gestures among younger Muslims, who may not have actually chosen to adopt a cultural headscarf, or the ones that they've seen as a part of the tradition that their mothers or fathers with beards and other visible signifiers applied, but one that came out through this generation and heightened political arena. But over these last 2 decades, that climate no longer remains and has changed. And that millennial generation who grew up within that time, I myself, one of them, the political climate has evolved, though the religion and the religious elements, of course, remain as they were. So the purpose through which it came about has become apparent in the way we've changed the way you visibly identify with the religion, and whether there's a feeling or need to express religion. And Generation Z in particular pose an incredibly interesting positioning, where they're in a society where social media presents religion and the way you might apply it, and where you learn from. So the examples of where you see how to wear a headscarf, how to dress, or how to apply your religion, or how to dress modestly, often come in the form of influences. So you don't learn through traditional means, and you see how that's made a remarkable change in the way the hijab has been adopted, and that spans not just, you know, within certain arenas, but because it's social media, it transcends national borders, and it becomes a trend, and it becomes a markedly different way to deploy the hijab and religious dress to their predecessors. And as a result, when we speak about it being a piece of cloth, but in this context, it reemerges just as that, because it appears without the context or the religious inclination, but through a form of dress that's then been adopted and taken on by a billion-dollar industry and utilized and capitalized by that industry, which makes it much easier to dress modestly because it's much more available. It's you know, advertised, it's normalized, it's a friendly face for hijab, it's commercial, but the context for it and the religious scrutiny remains, because when you see certain styles of hijab, those styles that don't fit within the parameters that are advertised and fit within the modes that aren't scrutinized or normalized, those remain controversial. And for this generation, where social media has become such a significant factor in their lives, that capitalization of modest fashion has made it a very different form of practice, and one that's akin to trend and the customs that they see within their generational grouping. I can see we're running slightly over time, so I'm just going to skip through a few things. Now, the visible appearance of Muslim women is used by some in secular societies to denote politics. For instance, in most cases, I presume it's highly unlikely to be the case that if you look around the streets of London, different people are observing hijab, you wouldn't necessarily know their politics through the way that they're dressed. But if you look at the conversation surrounding the hijab and describing its two models, hijab as cloth or hijab as political, but through traditional religious understandings, it's neither fundamentally cloth or political, but religious. And just to conclude, Muslims have been hyper-visible regardless of how they've dressed over the last 2 decades. And that's only brought further questions about religion and what it meant to be at the forefront of conversations. Wearing a hijab became commonplace among millennial teens and those older than them. And their association with it was no longer one of tradition or you know, like we were saying, with what their mothers wore, but in an era where social media has evolved that conversation and the political climate has changed, we look at other forms of politics that are integral to the generations of now, the conversations of now, like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. And they provide a very different political landscape, and new alliances can be seen, you know, above the religious alliance, where gender rights and race very much come into the conversation. So through my research, I often found that the academic work around hijab would be so focused on treating it like a trend, or treating it as one that completely took away any religious conversation, and seeking out how the hijab has changed throughout the last 2 decades, brought to surface where it remains now, where you do see this really visceral appliance on contrast to, you know, what does it mean to somebody that puts on a hijab today? You know, what does it mean to dress modestly? You know, we see these various laws that are still applied in certain countries, where you can't attain a certain type of job, you can't attend certain functions if you do wear a hijab. Yet, you know, we see it commonplace on the front covers of Vogue, or on catwalks, or on a mannequin. So on the one hand, it's become an immensely lucrative commercial product, but on the other, it remains a lightning rod of controversy, and depending on whether religion appears as a factor. Which, when it comes to the case of Halima Aden, does it not bring to light that hijab and modesty are not synonymous? And furthermore, what are the opinions on the fashion industry exploiting the hijab simply for representation, without understanding that for many, modesty comes with hijab, as Halima Aden was pictured with hijab, but was encouraged to wear it with more revealing outfits alongside it. I will attempt to answer some of that, and then I will ask the other two speakers as well. With Halima Aden, it was an incredibly interesting story, where after she posted on Instagram, I think it highlighted a number of the vulnerabilities within this entire industry setup, like you mentioned in this question. Quite clearly, they're not synonymous, because the way in which hijab, like I was saying with my research, it has been hollowed out by not just the industry, but the way in which the application of it has changed over the last decade, particularly with the rise of social media and the commercialization of the hijab, and the way it's being applied for the purposes for monetary gain. So we see it being used by social media influencers, as well as businesses, to make money. So it becomes a money maker, as opposed to one that is for the purpose of modesty and so forth. And with Halima Aden, that quite clearly became the case, and she revolted against that. And she said, I don't want it to be that for me, because actually it means something. And that's what she said. I mean, I broke the story with The Guardian, and then I interviewed her actually for TRC World. And when I spoke to her, we spoke about these issues, and she said, it means something to me. I have been wearing hijab for a number of years, and slowly but surely, because I didn't have others around me, and I think where you're speaking about exploitation of the fashion industry, she said people kept telling me, oh, why don't you wear it like this, or why don't you wear it like that? And slowly but surely, it was morphing in front of her eyes, and she lost control of the way she wore it, until one day she looks at herself and thought, this isn't hijab and this isn't me. So the fashion industry has a lack of understanding, and this is what Halima said through her own experience. She said a lack of understanding because there aren't that many individuals who wear the hijab in the industry. And one of the things that I've seen throughout my years of coverage of a lot of modest fashion events and so forth is that often even the women who are wearing a headscarf on the runway aren't actually hijab wearing women, but women who are just wearing a hijab, or a headscarf, I should say, because it's not a hijab necessarily, it's not worn without religious purpose, are wearing it simply for that runway show. So when they're wearing it to style this outfit. So to them, it doesn't mean anything more than that. And Halima Aden really, I think it was quite a moment for the modest fashion industry, because it was an awakening for somebody inside there who clearly had been through that journey of exploitation, and who'd been through that journey where she was reflecting on her own experience and saying it out loud, an experience that many others would agree with, maybe not want to speak about. When I spoke to a number of these individuals for research and for the work I've done, and often it's those themes do come up, and that feeling of having to, maybe being pushed to dress a certain way, or feeling like they want to because of the social pressures. But for sure, I hope that answers your question. And we see that in the way in which hijab or headscarf is deployed by women in this context as more of a trend and not necessarily for the purposes of modesty. Ursula, just very briefly on the note of exploitation within the fashion industry, do you want to comment on that?
I can just see my lights are flickering really badly. I hope they're not irritating anybody. I wouldn't want them to be a trigger in any way. I tried putting them down. But yes, I mean, you know, the trendification in the fashion industry is you know, wherever they see that something can be for the purpose of making money, they will forget deliberately the principles behind it. As I said, you know, with sustainability, we're seeing brands producing, you know, enormous, excessive amounts of clothes, who then turn around and say, well, here you go, here's a kind of, you know, an ethical and a sustainable collection. I mean, if that's not exploitative of nature principle, but above all, their own customers who don't understand, you know, they're kind of almost tricking them with an unknowledge over, you know, what they're trying to do. So, I mean, I'm obviously skeptical of any form of repression, and the idea, you know, reading stories of young girls or women not being allowed to wear what is right for them, for their religion or for their taste, is something that I find, you know, profoundly, you know, disrespectful and wrong. But unfortunately, this is how the fashion industry works. It's a very male generated industry, despite the fact that historically it was made with our hands, you know, our instruments, our tools, women. It's been taken over, opted in as a gigantic business, which is exploiting people and nature. I mean, when we look at the statistics of the Rana Plaza disaster, which is what triggered the whole of the fashion revolution movement, we know that 1,138 people died. 95% were young women. So this is an industry that exploits its workers as it exploits its wearers, because at the end of the day, the young women that are buying the fashion clothes are exploited in the same way, expected to look some way, not fitting in the right sizes. I mean, I have my youngest daughter who is beautiful, but big, abundant in her body. Going shopping with her is a nightmare, because nothing fits her, and yet she's sunshine in the way that she looks. But the industry doesn't cater for her. So every single aspect of the mainstream industry is exploitative. But fortunately, I'm in a beautiful position, because I see the dawn of things rather than the sunset. And I see a beautiful rise of young designers all over the world that are actually providing solutions right there where the problems are, which is why I keep on saying, let's not think of fashion as the way that we think of it now. You know, I spend most of my life trying to make space for these young designers, whether they're in India or in Africa or, you know, in Indonesia, in South America, who really have something different to say and something different for us to wear, which is the kind of clothing that does respect not just their communities, but, you know, the environment, and at the end of the day, also whoever buys from them. Because when you buy something that is made with love and not with exploitation, you will keep it more, you will mend it, you will repair it, you will pass it on generation after generation. It's important in your life rather than just disposable.
We've got another question on...
I'm going to try and sort my light out. Sorry if I go off camera 1 second. It's really...
saying, I often get asked, how can you exercise with these clothes? It's a really interesting question, because, and Zumrat, I'd love to hear from you on this, because there are sometimes tensions where clothing, long, loose clothing, can be difficult to maneuver in to do certain things, and I guess this is where you see the fact that it's become a lot easier because of this commercial you know, industry now, it's become a lot easier to find things that do make it easier to dress in a way that you know, that you're happy to dress in and caters to your needs, but also you can do the things that you want to do in them, you know, whether that's a burkini or, you know, the sports hijabs that were made by some of these brands like Nike and Adidas. And I sort of mentioned them earlier, where, you know, I know a Muslim fencer, Ibtihaj Muhammad, and there was a specific hijab made for her so she could compete in the Olympics. And some of the broadening of the industry has definitely allowed for that. And I think that is an aspect that certainly makes it easier to dress this way. I don't know, Zumra, do you have any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I agree. I think we all get these questions. I still remember a funny question that I got a friend of mine when I was studying at SOAS years ago. He was a young student from, I think, Japan, and he did not know anything about hijabi women or, you know, Muslim dress code. And he asked me if I could shower without a headscarf, or if I had to wear it all the time in my house as well, or even in the bathroom. Like that was a weird question that he genuinely asked. And I was like, oh my God. This is well, I mean, so you get these questions. I mean, he was very, very young, so I kind of give that to him and try to understand. But it's just, you know, when you walk into a restaurant or walk into a cafe in a non-Muslim country, you still get heads turned because you walk into that place, right? So there's this pressure, there's this you know, sense of abnormality about you, and there's also pressure that comes within your own society, your own community, because you have to dress in a certain way. Some of us dress more flexibly, but some of us, you know, are more modest. So that there are also levels of modesty. So we are not dressing the same way, all of us. We have different levels of modesty that we understand or we embrace. So for me, I can maybe, you know, I can choose a shorter shirt, but for someone else, for a friend of mine, it is not acceptable to exercise in even. So it's, I think solution should be, I mean, we should have more places, options with, you know, for female, for just females, for example. Like female only options are something that we lack in especially non-Muslim societies, non-Muslim countries. And I think this should be something that every industry should consider. And I am also glad that halal travel or halal industry is also kind of, you know, growing, because that gives us some options in that area. But of course, that's also another way of capitalizing, you know, on this issue. But, you know, in a way, I benefit from it. So I don't really, I don't want to bother with that aspect of the issue. But yeah, I mean, there's pressure. There is always this strangeness that you feel about yourself. I have a Nike swimsuit and I feel very comfortable in it, but I'm always hesitant to swim in public pools in my swimsuit, in my bikini, because I don't know, I'm not sure if I will be accepted or I will be welcomed when I go there. So you know, there are places, there are public pools that I can go, but I don't feel comfortable even going there, even trying, even attempting to it, because I don't know if I'll be welcomed. So this is something that you have in mind all the time, and that is restrictive enough. I mean, there doesn't have to be, you know, rules or laws, but there is this stigma, there is this understanding, or this unwelcoming sense towards you, that look that view towards you, and that is restrictive enough.
I guess there are layers to the commercialization of modest dress that are enabling factors that enable Muslim women to participate in layers and elements of society where they would otherwise be restricted. And that, like you said, with women wanting to go swimming or take part in certain activities or exercise or take part in the Olympics. And we know there are still various changes taking place in what is and isn't allowed for athletes. We've got a few other questions. Another question here: are there tensions with Generation Z's practice of modest fashion with religion? I mean, it's a large part of my research where it's focused on the changes that have taken place with Generation Z, and that's particularly and mostly as a result of the changing social media landscape and where the religious information is being derived from. So you see the practice and changing form of modest dress and hijab in the shape of these social media influencers who play a crucial role in the way it's then applied by Generation Z. And we know the social media landscape as we go on. For Generation Z, the world, the internet has always been there. So it exists in a way that it didn't exist for the millennials and generations that are older, that have learned in different ways. But now it's become a critical form of gaining access and information, and it's open globally. So you can be learning how to put on a hijab, which you might want to know, and where you might have traditionally gone to a particular book which has information on this is a headscarf or this is what it might look like. Now you might go on to YouTube and think, how do you wear a headscarf, or what, how do you put it on, or what does it look like? And where that information is derived from has a huge impact in the way in which it turns to be applied. And those tensions I see, play out in what we were talking about with the hollowing of the way it does materialize, where for the generations beforehand, particularly with millennials over the last 2 decades, that political factor played a significant role in the heightened visibility of the hijab. So much more women began, a huge number of women began to observe, religious dress, a much larger number, particularly in Western secular nations, a much larger number than in the generation beforehand as a result of that. And that created this sort of big juxtaposition within that social fabric. So when you remove that political layer, it returns back to wearing it for religious purpose. So for some who wear the hijab, it certainly is for a religious purpose, I'm sure, but it's also a trend now. It's also a large, it's mainstream trend that you see on the runway, that you see on influencers, that you see in business models, on commercial factors, on, it's not necessarily just worn for religious purpose. It's being a part of the clan, and that's you see that more and more within that generation. We've got a few. I hope that answered your question. There's another question here. There's another note here. Not question, but this resonates with me. Where I live, no Muslim women were wearing a headscarf 10 years ago. It was a lonely experience. I felt more comfortable wearing it in London, where the city is more multi-ethnic. Things have changed now. I definitely have become comfortable with it and experimental with it. Zumrad, do you think, I guess one of the other factors and layers through seeing the varying ways in which people do wear the hijab, do you think it's become much easier to be experimental and wear it in different ways?
You mean now,
Yes.
right? You know, yeah. Well, yeah. When you have options, of course, yeah, you can be more experimental and you can find your own, you know, way, your own way of expressing your religion with your clothes, right? When I first started wearing the headscarf, as I explained in my in my speech before, I did not have any options. You know, it was just one style that was available to me, and I was also wearing my my mother's clothes sometimes because I didn't have anything else, and there was no option. Like there was no market interest. There were no you know, brands or stores for us, and it was hard to find your own. It was, I mean, you make a decision. You want to live your life in a certain way, but you also want to look nice, look good, and also, you know, to feel comfortable in your own clothes, in your own style. And that was not an option. We were wearing the same way, all of us almost, you know, and there were not many options, and people like me looked the same way, and that was depressing, you know, in a way. And now I feel that I'm more, you know, I have more options. It's more, I think it's liberating in a way, and it's certainly making my life so much easier. But you know, wearing the headscarf, the headscarf still like gives you a certain look, and it is something that I think not just us, but so many people, others, non-Muslims, or even Muslims who are not feeling the same way about should normalize this look, this type of expression, this way of expressing religion in their minds, in their lives, so we would not feel like, you know, we're different. So that's the only thing I guess I am still having problems with. I feel more comfortable certainly in my clothes right now because I can choose, and there are more options, and it's a great thing. But I also think that there's still a lot of work to be done, and there's still a lot of, you know, progress to be made in normalizing hijab, in normalizing headscarf in our societies. So even we feel, you know, feel comfortable enough in our own clothes, we should also feel comfortable in our workplaces, in the streets of, you know, European cities, for example, or the US. So it's just, you know, I like the way how the fashion industry is expanding, but we also need to progress as a society and as in our understanding of religion and religious expression.
We've only got a few minutes left, but we've got another note here making reference to the previous comment about feeling isolated within certain sort of areas and being much more easy in multi-ethnic cities. Just as you described, observant Jewish girls and young women in our neighborhood were chronically criticized for bike riding in long skirts, as women simply going about their daily activities in long dresses and opaque stockings. As fashions have changed and various dress lengths and types of visible leggings are available and acceptable in society at large, these females draw less negative attention, which was exactly their aim in dressing modestly, less attention. I mean, that makes reference to a really interesting point on a sort of attention and the gaze and the male gaze and the controlling that gaze through dress, which is incredibly interesting, but we probably don't have too much time to get into, but in particular, making reference to the, you know, Jewish women who observe modest dress. In conversation with Bathsheba Hay, the Jewish American designer who turned to Orthodox practice. You know, she said she she didn't have anything available to her when she said she was interested in fashion, she loved the arts, but she couldn't dress in the way that she wanted to until she started making her own clothes. And obviously this just brings to surface that this conversation around modest dress isn't one for just Muslim women, but women from so many different groupings. And the conversations even around the way it's applied for Generation Z. There's Raina Lewis, the academic from the London School of Fashion, speaks a lot about this reference to sort of hot chani in Jewish literature and the way in which certain groupings are stigmatized, and the changing ways in which Jewish women apply modest dress. So thank you very much, everyone who has sent in a question. And I know there are a few more questions which I would love to sort of get into. So do keep in touch. Thank you to everyone who has attended. Thank you to our speakers and the William Temple Foundation. We hope to, host more events on similar themes. So do keep your eyes peeled.